Joining us for this program in the South Carolina Humanities Electoral Initiative. This project began in October 2020 and will continue through April 2021, and is being offered by 4 South Carolina universities: Clemson, Francis Marion, the University of South Carolina, and Lander University. You can watch programs in this series which you have missed, or register to attend future programs at the SC Humanities website that's on your screen. The Electoral Initiative was made possible by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and based in Arlington, Virginia. It's funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The Why It Matters initiative provides free humanities programs to engage the public in collaborative, accessible, and thought-provoking dialogues on the importance of electoral and civic participation. Tonight's program, as you see, is entitled Lessons from November: Who Voted, Who Didn't, and Why Does It Matter? Our 2 speakers will examine issues from this past November election, such as voting rights and voter turnout and voter suppression efforts. As we now come to the screen, allow me to provide some brief introductions. I'm Ashley Woodowis. I'm a professor of political science and chair of Lander's Department of Government, Criminology, and Sociology. My areas of specialization include American politics and political philosophy, with a focus on civic engagement. I'm joined by this evening's distinguished scholars. Amy Black is professor of political science at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. She earned her PhD in political science at MIT. The author of a half-dozen books and numerous scholarly articles, Dr. Black has most recently co-authored with Michael Ware a Trinity Forum report entitled Christianity, Pluralism, and Public Life in the United States: Insights from Christian Leaders. Dr. Black is a specialist in American government, and her research interests include religion and politics, the presidency, and Congress. Quentin Kidd is the Dean of the College of Social Sciences, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Wasson Center for Public Policy at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. With a PhD from Texas Tech, Dr. Kidd's research, which has been used in a number of federal court cases, has focused on Southern politics, race, and voting behavior. I think you can see we are in for a rich and informative session tonight with these 2 scholars. So let's talk about how this session will work. First, our 2 speakers will each provide a presentation of about 10 to 12 minutes. Then we will turn to you, our audience, for your questions. There is, of course, an ongoing chat box provided for you at the bottom right of your screen. But to ask a question directly to the speakers, please use the Ask a Question feature. Even if you don't wish to ask a question, you can see the questions being asked and you can cast your vote for the one you want our speakers to address. If time allows, we will follow our audience time with a discussion among the 3 of us before concluding. But let's begin with our presentations. First, I invite Dr. Quentin Kidd to offer his comments on lessons from November.
Thank you, Dr. Woodowis. And let me just say it's an honor to be on the panel with Dr. Black and with everybody here. I titled my talk "The Ebbs and Flows of the Right to Vote in America." My goal here is to provide sort of a 30,000-foot perspective on the ebbs and the flows of the right to vote. And Dr. Black is going to, I think, come along and provide some contemporaneous discussion about 2020. And I think the 2 of those will go really well together. So if you think about the ocean and the ebb and the flow of the tide, I sort of use that as a paradigm, as a narrative for the right to vote in the United States. And sometimes the tide ebbs out further than at other times, and sometimes the tide flows a little bit further in than other times. And I think that's a nice way, to analogize the right to vote in the United States. And let me make a point here. Once the right to vote has legally been granted, it isn't taken back in any significant ways. But what happens is efforts to make it harder to suppress vote or to somehow minimize the what a right to vote means kicks in. And so think about that as I talk through the history of this over the next several minutes, and I think that'll bring us to a really nice place in explaining where we are today. So if you start at 1776, the right to vote, I characterize it as sort of a slow flow from the start of the country, the founding. The constitutional period viewed the right to vote in very narrow terms. It wasn't suppression because, until 1776, nobody had the right to vote in this country. But once the country became what it is today under the U.S. Constitution, the right to vote was narrowly defined. And it was narrowly defined around property ownership, because it was thought that property owners were taxpayers and they were the responsible, parties enough to be a part of the political system. Most states, it's important to note, at that time restricted property ownership to men and to white men. And so effectively, initially the right to vote was property owning white men. Some states also had a religious test. States like Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, South Carolina had religious tests. You had to be a Christian to vote. Those religious tests were built into those state constitutions, and so it took them a little bit of time to remove those. But initially, the right to vote was very narrowly defined, and it slowly, over the next 100 years, expanded. It flowed out to more and more people in the population. Slowly, from state to state, the property qualification was abolished. And it's important to note that in the Constitution originally, states were given the responsibility to decide who could vote. It was only court cases and constitutional amendments over time that sort of moved some authority to the federal government to determine who could vote. But over time, from 1776 to 1876, the right to vote slowly flowed out to the population beyond just property owning white men. Again, the property qualification was eliminated. Property owning women in some states were allowed to vote. Property owning non-white people were allowed to vote. And the latter part of this 100-year period, the Civil War happened from 1861 to 1865. And the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, marked a major expansion of the right to vote. The 14th Amendment expanded citizenship to people born or naturalized in the United States. The 15th Amendment removed the racial test. And so by the end of the first 100 years of the country under the current Constitution, the right to vote expanded very dramatically away from just the narrow focus on white property owning men. And the end of the Civil War, in fact, the end of Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period, 1877, begins the first major ebb. The practical right to vote is removed to some extent. And this was characterized by major efforts at voter suppression. Most Southern states began to enact what we call Jim Crow laws. Things like poll taxes, literacy and comprehension tests, residency and record keeping requirements. So think about this. It's not that the right to vote was taken away because it was protected and guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments, but the reality of the ability to vote was essentially removed. If you were too poor to pay a poll tax, you couldn't vote. If you weren't able to pass a literacy test or a comprehension test, then you weren't able to vote. And the comprehension test was as nefarious as any of them, because a comprehension test often meant, here's a short paragraph, read it and tell me what it says, what it means to you. And so that meant the person who was testing you essentially was the subjective judge about whether you comprehended that paragraph or not. And then residency and record keeping requirements. So if you had previously been a slave freed at the end of the Civil War, there may not be a record of your birth or a record of your residency that went back far enough to meet the residency requirements. And so from 1877 to 1920, we saw major efforts at suppressing the vote. So the practical right to vote ebbed. There are many states across the South where for a decade in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, no Blacks were registered to vote. In Louisiana and North Carolina, there's a decade where no Blacks were registered to vote. They essentially couldn't pay the poll tax and or pass a literacy and comprehension test and or determine their residency and record keeping requirements. And so Jim Crow, as it relates to suppressing the right to vote, was very effective. In the middle of this period of Jim Crow suppression, which really spans to the mid-1960s, you have a massive flow of the right to vote. And that is the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1920, which essentially guaranteed the right to women to vote. And so you have a major part of the population that has the right to vote expanded to them at the very same time that another big chunk of the population is having its voting rights suppressed. And so you have this really mixed period from the 1920s to the mid-1960s, really, where you have two currents kind of going on at the same time. In the 1950s, you get sort of an effort to stem the ebb. The Civil Rights Act starts. The Civil Rights Movement starts in 1954, and attempts to really push back on Southern states and the effects of Jim Crow laws on the right to vote. But what do Southern states do? They sort of double down on their efforts to suppress the vote. They increase their vigilancy on the use of the poll tax. They increase their use of the literacy test. They institute an English language requirement test. They get really stringent about residency requirements. If you want to know what some of these things look like, you can go online and Google, poll tax, North Carolina 1950s, or literacy tests, Louisiana 1950s, and you can see examples of what these look like. I have a neighbor who lives down the street from me who immigrated to the U.S. from Ireland in the mid-1950s, and he moved to Birmingham, Alabama. And he told me the first time he was able to register to vote after he became a citizen, he remembers taking the literacy test. Everybody had to do it. And so at the same time that you have the civil rights movement that is attempting to push back on the Jim Crow laws really across the board, voter suppression laws is a major part of that, you get Southern states that are cracking down on their efforts to suppress the vote even more. By the mid-1960s, of course, you have a major flow. The tide is coming in, essentially. You have the 24th Amendment, which in 1964, which eliminates the poll tax. You have the Voting Rights Act passed Congress in 1965. You have the voting age lowered to 18 in 1971. You have protections for language minorities added to the Voting Rights Act in 1975. You have protections for disabled people added to the Voting Rights Act in 1982. And in 1983, you have something called the Voter Motor Law that is passed that essentially automatically registers people to vote when they go register their cars. And so it's not really even a big thing anymore to go register to vote. You're registered when you go register your car these days at your local DMV. And so from the mid-1960s to about 2013, you have this major expansion of the right to vote and a removal of a lot of the voter suppression rules and laws that were put in place post-Civil War during Reconstruction. But something happened in 2013 that I think has caused what I would call the contemporary ebb that we're in right now, and that is in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court came down on a case called Shelby County versus Holder and ruled that the pre-clearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because it used data that was 40 years old, and so it effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, which is the major piece of legislation that had protected rights to vote and had been the tool that was used to push back on voter suppression during this time. And immediately after the passage of Shelby versus Holder, states began to institute policies that were designed to suppress the vote again. In fact, the very day that the Supreme Court announced their decision in Shelby County versus Holder, the state of Texas imposed an ID requirement for voting. They were ready. The moment the Supreme Court issued that ruling, the state of Texas acted. Within weeks and months, states started doing things like closing polling locations or consolidating polling locations, building in additional requirements for registration or restrictions on registration, purging polls. Essentially, if states would go through their voter polls and say, look, if we can't confirm that this voter lives at this address anymore, we're going to take their name off the voter registration list. And most recently, the previous presidential administration had attempted to put a citizenship question on the census, the 2020 census, in an effort to essentially affect redistricting, which has an effect on voter registration and the ability of voters in particular congressional districts. So all of this that we're living through right now, all of the controversies that you see in the news and you hear the two sides argue about, I think effectively go back to that 2013 Supreme Court case and the fact that the Voting Rights Act was essentially gutted by that Supreme Court case. And so what that means is any state who makes any change to their voter registration rules or their voting requirements, if they were previously under the Voting Rights Act requirements, they now aren't automatically under it. Somebody has to sue and claim that what they're doing is wrong, and then that sort of leads to all sorts of litigation. And we've seen a lot of litigation since 2013 over this. So where do voting rights go next? If you think about where we are in this country in terms of the practical legal ability to vote, we're nearly at universal legal ability to vote. In some states, if you're a convicted felon, you can't vote. But most everywhere, if you're 18 or older, you can vote. There's nothing keeping you from voting. Again, in some states, if you're a convicted felon, then you can't, etc. But so long as you are not a convicted felon, in most states you can vote. So we have nearly legal universal right to vote. And so what the immediate future of voting rights in America are probably around efforts to suppress and the pushback on those efforts to suppress. Congress doesn't look like it's in any mood to pass any major legislation. There's an effort to reaffirm the Voting Rights Act in Congress, but I don't know that it actually can pass both chambers. There could be major court cases, but given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's just as likely that they go one way as the other way. It doesn't look like if a case gets to the Supreme Court is necessarily going to restore the Voting Rights Act, for example. So it looks to me like efforts going forward are going to be led by organizations, for example, the Fair Fight organization that Stacey Abrams put together, and other organizations like that on both the right and the left to fight out who can practically vote in this context where we have nearly universal legal right to vote. And so I'll stop there because I think Dr. Black is going to pick up really well at that point and talk about 2020 and how it looked. So I thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kidd. Before we invite Dr. Black to make her comments, I would just like to ask you a question, and that, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is we've had this historical ebb and flow about voting rights and access to voting, and that our contemporary moment has been shaped and influenced by that 2013 Supreme Court case, Shelby County v. Holder. And I did notice that they announced that decision at 10 o'clock, and Texas by 4:45 the same day began to implement their voting restrictions. Congress in 2006 had voted to renew the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. And there were overwhelming majorities of both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, in the Congress of 2006. And yet 7 years later, the Supreme Court strikes it down. Can you help us to understand? You've said the court said, well, the data is old, but what was their kind of rationale? What kind of basic philosophic point did the court want to make about kind of where America is at in 2013?
So good question. I think the underlying ideological
and we will try to get Dr. Kidd back with us here. I remember in the stories leading up to the case, Shelby County v. Holder, you'll remember, of course, that Barack Obama was the president at the time. And the question was, well, America has changed. We have our first African-American president. Surely the restrictions that are placed on 12 states, most of them in the South, that require us to get any kind of changes to our voting scheme to be pre-approved by a federal judge or the Justice Department. That's Holder. That's Eric Holder. He was the Attorney General at the time. The argument was, why should we in Alabama or South Carolina have to get permission to change our voting because the issues that led to that are no longer salient. Those issues are no longer valid. Look, we have an African American as our president. Surely the South has changed. Times have changed. And that was the kind of popular argument that led up to Shelby County v. And in fact, the Chief Justice, John Roberts, who ruled in the majority, did say the South has changed. And as Dr. Kidd was pointing out, immediately upon that decision, states all across the South began to change and tighten up those restrictions. While we wait for Dr. Kidd to rejoin us, I think I will at this point invite Dr. Black to share her comments on lessons from November. So, Dr. Black?
Great. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity for me to be a part of this conversation. And Dr. Kidd, I think, has set us up well. As he mentioned, he was going to give us the historical ebbs and flows. And my goal in my few minutes this evening is to talk just a little bit about 2020. And my title is Overcoming Obstacles. There were a lot of obstacles in the 2020 election. And I just want us to look and see kind of what happened. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about the distinctive electoral context of 2020. Look briefly at some of the data on who voted, who didn't, was it fair? And then I also want to offer what I think are a couple of lessons learned, and I'm sure many of you will have others to suggest as well. So why don't we start with this distinctive electoral context? In fact, I think we can use the term unique, which is often used incorrectly. We can use that term for 2020. First of all, we had vast logistical problems that were going to complicate casting ballots. With the COVID pandemic, it throws everything in the entire election into just a lot of confusion. We had concerns about safety for voters. We had concerns about safety for poll workers. How can you allow for social distancing? What kind of protective measures do you need to take into place to try to protect people from the virus? So basically, we needed to rethink the entire logistics of how to vote. A second piece of the 2020 context is that the primaries, we didn't have a lot of time for primaries. And often what we found is that in the primary elections, we had a lot of examples of what not to do. There was a shortage of poll workers. Obviously, many people were concerned about working during a pandemic, did not want to get ill. And particularly as we have more likely to have senior citizens working at the polls, and they were the most likely to be at risk. We also had election systems that just weren't updated to manage this vast increase, particularly the vast increase in absentee voting. So we had changes needed and not much time. Just to give you one example of how primaries kind of set us up with negative examples would be Wisconsin. Their primary was on April 7th. They were under a stay-at-home order. There was some pressure to move the primary, but they decided to go ahead on April 7th. 7,000 poll workers quit, unwilling to work the election. In Milwaukee, which was the worst hit, Milwaukee went from having 180 polling stations open to having 5. Some voters had to wait in line for hours. This was not what people wanted. A study later found that there was a link between in-person voting and increased rates of COVID. So no one wanted these kinds of problems to continue. So the third thing about the context was the path that most jurisdictions chose, especially for that general election in November. And this was to expand voting options. Nationwide, this idea is we have this pandemic, we want to keep people safe. So the best way to keep people safe is to give as many ways to vote as possible so fewer people will feel the pressure to show up on election day. And so what we saw was the encouragement of multiple formats for voting. We saw reductions in restrictions to absentee voting. We saw shifts to almost all or completely voting by mail. And we saw lots of expansion of early voting, number of days for early voting, number of places for early voting. The net result, I think it's fair to say that this election was the most accessible to most Americans of one in decades. So if you wanted to vote, the opportunities were great for you to do so. I'll give you an example from your fine state of South Carolina. South Carolina relaxed its strict absentee voting restrictions where you have to say why you need an absentee ballot, that you can include COVID as your reason. And what we found is the number of people who voted by absentee in South Carolina doubled. In the 2016 election, 26% of South Carolina voters chose absentee ballots. It went up to 52% in 2020. So the primaries gave us examples of what not to do, but impressively, by November, most states had figured out ways to overcome some of the pandemic problems. So let's look a little bit at the data. Who voted, who didn't, and was it fair? First of all, one answer to who voted, lots of people. We had record voter turnout in the 2020 election. If you count by sheer numbers, it was the most voters ever. Nationally, 159.6 million voters participated in the November general election. Both presidential candidates received more votes than any presidential candidate ever. Donald Trump received 74.2 million and Joe Biden received 81.3 million. Those are just pretty staggering numbers. There's also lots of voter energy in both parties. We had record high numbers of early voters. 101.5 million Americans voted early in this election. This was more than double what had already broken a record from 2016 of 47 million voters. When we look at turnout rates, similar story. 2/3 of the voting population voted. It's the highest national turnout that we've had in 120 years. Ranged from a high of 80% turnout in Minnesota to a low of 55% in Oklahoma. And state by state, when we look at the turnout rates, in every state, turnout increased compared to the last presidential election in 2016. It seems that the COVID-inspired electoral changes contributed, made it easier, lots more opportunities and possibilities for voting, and people seem to take advantage of those opportunities. One example, 7 of the 10 states where the turnout increased the most went to vote by mail. One, Washington, already had it in place, but 6 of them moved to all mail-in ballots for this election. Another piece of who voted are sort of the demographics. What kinds of people voted? What do we know? I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to show you a few examples. But when we look at data sources from the election, I'm going to look at data from the AP Votecast Survey, which was a survey of about 130,000 Americans right up for the vote. It's kind of a stand-in for an exit poll. We can look at those data just to give us a little bit of some sense of some key demographic characteristics of the voters. So let's look at our first chart. Our first chart is going to show us voters by age. So what we'll see here, 13% of the voters were among our youngest voters, 18 to 29, 23%, 30 to 44, 36% of the voting population was 45 to 64, and 28% of those voted are 65 and older. The voters skew a little bit older than the general population, but pretty decent representation across these age groups. Let's look next at presidential electorate by race. 74% of the voters in 2020 were white, compared to 11% African American, 9% Latino, 2% Asian, and 5% other. When we compare this to both the general population and registered voters, we see a slight overrepresentation of white voters. The African American vote is actually very close to both population numbers and registration numbers, and some underrepresentation of Latino or Hispanic voters. Next slide, we'll look at income. Comparing 3 sort of common categories here. 38% of the voters in 2020 record a household income of less than $50,000. 36% are in that middle category, earning more than $50,000 and less than $100,000. And then 26% earning $100,000 or more household income. The middle income voters were actually the least represented of the group, and the highest income voters somewhat overrepresented. And then one more example, demographic characteristic, 2020 presidential electorate by education. Here we saw that 27% of the voters had high school education or less, 34% have completed some college, 25% have a 4-year college degree, and 15% some postgraduate study. There's a slight overrepresentation of those with at least a college degree, 36% of adults over 25 versus 40%. So again, some slight differences here. So it matters who voted and who didn't, but also pretty representative election in many ways. So that's a little bit about the who voted demographics. The next question is, was it fair? That's a big, complicated question, but I can give you a short answer to that. Post-election, we have overwhelming evidence that this was a fair election. It's confirmed in a couple of ways. The first way is the fairness of the election, I would say, is confirmed by the courts. The Trump campaign and their allies filed dozens of lawsuits in states where Biden won narrow victories. There was a lot of claims of widespread voter fraud, and these claims were then adjudicated. As of a tabulation as of January 8th, 63 cases filed. The Trump campaign or their allies won 1 of those 63 cases. There's a case in Pennsylvania about ballot curing. It affected a few ballots, but nothing that would affect the outcome of the election. There were 63 losses, and these were losses in state courts and federal courts. The judges who ruled on these included Trump appointees. We had a wide range of judges ruling. Most of the cases, some were rejected on the merits, some were dismissed. Some were dismissed by the judges, and some were even dismissed by the lawyers when asked for more evidence, and they withdrew the cases. So the courts overwhelmingly, they looked at concerns about fraud, they looked at concerns about problems, and they said, we don't see those concerns. There's not evidence to prove that case. I think the fairness of the election was also confirmed by recounts in close states. In some of the states, the Trump campaign chose to pursue recounts. And what we found is that the tabulations were overall accurate. Sure, there were minor discrepancies. There always are. But there were not any discrepancies that change the outcome of the election. There was no evidence found of problems with voting machines or software, as some of the rumors had suggested, and there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud. We always are going to find small instances of fraud, and that's not insignificant and it's important, but there was nothing widespread. Famously, the Attorney General at the time, Bill Barr, said on December 1st, after the Department of Justice had been looking into this for some time, quote, "To date, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election." So no evidence of widespread fraud. So lots of people voted, and it seems like it was a pretty fair election. So what are some lessons learned? Let me offer two. And like I say, I'm sure you may have more, and that'd be great to discuss. One lesson I think we've learned is that when we reduce barriers to voting, you can increase turnout while maintaining security. And I think that's a good thing for democracy. Throughout American history, as Dr. Kidd has shown us, we've seen many organized campaigns to suppress voting, but the 2020 election gives us a playbook for how to turn the tide, how to encourage voting, how to get more people involved and do so safely and well. Overall, the new formats worked well. Even with rushed schedules to compare, the states were able to get what they needed done. And with more time to prepare, I expect that we will see even smoother elections in the future. A second lesson I think we've learned is that the post-election legal ballots and the narrative of a stolen election have consequences. And we're going to see these consequences reverberate for some time. Courts across the country, as I've already said, weighed the election complaints and dismissed almost all of them. So they didn't find that the narrative was correct. But at the same time, disinformation campaigns convinced many, many voters that the election was stolen. So what does that mean? Well, for one, this narrative of election fraud is going to linger for years, if not decades. I think we'll see more decreased trust in elections and decreased trust in our elected officials, which I find a really sad thing for American democracy. I think it also will lead to probably more calls to restrict combating fraud. Even though there wasn't a lot of fraud found, people will use that as a rallying cry. And in sort of an ironic twist, I also think that it's very likely that this narrative will suppress future voter turnout, especially among Republicans, who are the most likely to believe those narratives. And so those that are spreading the information the most are the ones that are probably the most likely to suffer because of it. So overall, lots of people voted. I think 2020 was an example of a year where we can see greater participation, greater opportunity. And I hope that it is something that we look back on as a reminder of ways that we can increase participation and keep our democracy vibrant.
Thank you, Dr. Black. In just a minute, we're going to turn to our audience and let them ask questions of us. I think both Dr. Kidd and Dr. Black have provided presentations that should elicit a lot of questions. But before we do, I have a question for Dr. Black. Sure. And it's actually a question about a particular piece of data that you shared with us, and that's the Latino turnout. You said it's underrepresented in terms of the percentage of Latinos in the population or the voting population. Can you reflect on, and yet part of the story coming out of 2020 was the key Latino vote in certain districts in Miami-Dade and in counties in Texas. Can you reflect for us, what are some explanations for low Latino turnout?
Sure. Well, it's, all these stories are complicated stories. So part of it has to do probably with place to place. And there's, of course, been a history of sort of complex relationships between Latino population and the government. So I think part of it is a story of distrust in government. Also, we heard a lot about the Latino vote because it was an important vote. To say that it was lower than the population is not to say that it is therefore unimportant. Right. And part of it too is just my comparison, because we have population numbers and then we also have those who are eligible to vote. And so part of that is going to be, there will be some noted in our population numbers who don't have citizenship and therefore don't have the right to vote. So that's part of it. So it's an interesting vote and it's a key vote. And one of the narratives I think that came out of this election that is really important is just a reminder, which is true whenever we try to cut the election, try to look at groups of people. We're looking at really large, heterogeneous, very diverse groups. And so to say Hispanic voters or Latino voters as if they all vote alike is not particularly helpful. And so that was one of the narratives I do think that was really helpful coming out of this election, is a reminder different Hispanic communities tend to vote in different ways, that there's a lot of diversity in the Latino vote.
Yeah, thank you. Is Dr. Kidd back with us?
As far as I know, I am.
Hey, welcome back. Glad to have you. So we're going to move towards questions from the audience, but I just wanted to give you a chance to come back to the question I had about the Shelby County decision and just help us to understand again why the majority made that decision and what was their view of America in making that decision.
Yeah, so ultimately the sort of ideological philosophical argument that carried that decision is rooted in federalism and the conservative argument that sort of the federal government overseeing what states should if you're viewing the Constitution this way, what states should be responsible for is what carried that argument. So in other words, this is a states' rights thing. So if you're a student of history or if you're old enough to remember the states' rights arguments, it goes back in some ways to the states' rights arguments and the idea, because what the Shelby case effectively did is it said a state does not have to go to the federal government and get approved for changes that they want to make, laws they want to pass, or the new way they want to redistrict their state. They can just do it. And if somebody thinks it's wrong, then they can sue. But the state doesn't have to go get permission, if you will, from the federal government, from the Justice Department, before they can make the changes that they want to make. And that's rooted in this idea of federalism and that the states have a certain autonomy that the federal government can't take from them. And ultimately, that's really at the heart philosophically of that Shelby County case.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, and I think, Dr. Kidd, is probably a question that is right down your alley. The question says, obviously voting by mail has traditionally been focused on traditional absentee ballots, but there's been controversy about had there been controversy about security of voting by mail prior to 2020. So there was a lot of, worry about the vote by mail this time around. Has that happened before, that kind of anxiety? And what explains it, do you think?
No, and Dr. Black can probably talk about this also. No, there are 4 or 5 states that have been voting by mail for decades. They tend to be Western states out in the West, Oregon, for example, that have sort of a more libertarian political culture. So they sort of lean more on individual choice. And there's just little to no evidence of widespread voter fraud or widespread problems when it comes to voting by mail. As Dr. Black mentioned, there are always issues in every election. There's always something, when you have millions of people doing something, somebody's going to do something wrong. Somebody's going to break the rule. The question is it a large enough number of people? And is there systematic rule breaking in one way or the other that sort of favors one side or the other? There's just no evidence of this in the states where voting by mail has been very common for a long time. I think in Washington state, you can't even vote in person anymore. I think they've gone totally vote by mail, and they've been doing it for a decade.
And I can add.
Yeah, please.
It's it has proven extremely safe. It has proven pretty fraud-free. I would say, at least I know in some of the states, there were some concerns raised at the very, very beginning. Sort of, will this work? Will people try to stuff ballot boxes? So there were definitely some activists who were saying this is opening things up to fraud. So those types of concerns were raised, but we have had vote by mail. Washington and Oregon Oregon, I think, is first, then Washington. Colorado now has all vote by mail, and we've had enough election cycles, and they've calculated it. I can't give you the exact statistic, but it's like 0.00000 something percent ballots that were found to be fraudulent. So it's actually probably the safest form of voting that we've found, and also, interestingly, saves a lot of money. We don't think about how expensive it is to run elections, but it is far cheaper to conduct an election entirely by mail than to staff all of the voting places.
Can I just say one more thing? It also, and I think this is a point that I try to make as often as possible, there are far more instances of registration fraud than voter fraud. Most of the things that you hear in the news where a reporter, not to dish on any reporters that might be looking at this, but most of the time when you hear about a voter fraud or something like that, what you're really hearing is that somebody registered illegally or inappropriately, or they did something in the context of registration. There's actually very, very, very little voter fraud, actual voter fraud. There's far more registration fraud, and even that is such a small percentage that it's hard to calculate.
Thank you. Well, we've talked about politics. Let's talk about that other taboo subject that you're never supposed to talk about. Let's talk about religion. And let's talk about religion in the 2020 elections. I mean, the media was really preoccupied, I think, with two main stories. One was the white evangelical vote, and the other was about Biden's Catholicism. And Dr. Black, you want to lead us off with a kind of general picture about the place of religion in 2020?
So the first thing I'll say is we'll know more when we get slightly better data, because the exit polls did not break down religion the way that we religion and politics scholars do. So got to wait a little bit on that. But we do have some preliminary information that I think is very helpful. So white evangelicals, the way they're handled usually in this pre-polling data is sort of asking people if they would define themselves as an evangelical. And if they say yes, they're white, they count. In the AP Votecast, 28% of the electorate described themselves as a white evangelical, and their vote split 76 Trump, 24% Biden. This is a pattern that we have seen for a couple of decades at least now, that white evangelicals are overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, Republican, usually in that kind of 75 to 80% range. The Catholic vote.
Excuse me, Dr. Black, but that's a pretty significant drop from 2016, isn't it? I mean, didn't Trump have like 86% or something like that, 84%?
The original number was 81, and then it was adjusted to 80 when we did the magic weighting adjustments. So it's actually pretty close. 80 was higher than Romney had received, but it's kind of within the range. And you also have to remember we've got margins of sampling error as well.
Okay.
So a little bit higher.
Okay.
The Catholic vote is a vote that in recent decades has been pretty evenly split between the two parties. I think in large part, although not the only reason, because the issues that the Catholic Church is going to place first and foremost in teaching kind of split evenly between the Republican and Democratic parties. So the Catholic vote this year split pretty even. Biden received 52% of the Catholic vote. Trump received 47%. And again, plus or minus, so a sampling error, it was about split in half. So that's not that different than other patterns. I do think, though, that Biden's Catholic faith was a really important piece for a couple of reasons. One, he's only our second Catholic president elected. But another, not just his Catholic faith, but his faith in general. He was open about his religious practice. You would see signs that he was religious. He talked about the importance of faith. This is something that Democratic politicians have been less comfortable talking about in recent years. And so that was a change. And I do think that helped Biden in the election with religious voters in general, even if they weren't Catholics, just a sense of here is someone who is also a person of faith.
Thank you. While we wait for other questions to come our way, I'd like both of you to reflect on, we've celebrated the turnout, what a magnificent turnout, and overcoming barriers and obstacles to vote. And yet the Brennan Center has documented that in the month of January, more than 100 bills have been introduced in 28 states to restrict voting. And now, obviously, there are other bills have been introduced to expand voting. But Dr. Kidd, I mean, Are we ebbing? Are we flowing? I mean, how do we leave this wonderful democratic moment with this massive turnout that Dr. Black helped us understand, and we turn right around and we try to pass all these laws in 28 states?
So I think this is where the sort of next phase of the struggle, the voting rights struggle, is. We'll never know the answer to this, but I've been fascinated. I've thought, over the last couple of months about what would we be talking about right now if the pandemic had not happened? Because as Dr. Black mentioned and explained, the pandemic itself led to short-term changes in several states' voting rules that allowed for people to vote absentee, early, etc. And I wonder, we'll never know, but would Biden have won Wisconsin, or would he have won Michigan or Pennsylvania if it hadn't been for this? Georgia, we'll never know. But what's happened is among groups that are attempting to, again, restrict the right to vote, there are efforts essentially to tighten up and pull back on some of the very things that led to a real big turnout. And that is, there are many states that say, look, we politicians in states that say, look, we don't want to make it a habit to let people vote no excuse absentee, for example, or no excuse early, because we don't want that level of turnout. And so again, in terms of the legal ability to vote, essentially, unless you're a convicted felon, if you're over 18 and you're a citizen of the United States, you can vote. The question is, how easy is it for you to vote, or how difficult is it for you to vote? And that's where the real challenge now is as it relates to voting rights. And so I think we're going to see that over the next, 4 to 8 to a decade. We're going to see that both sides, if you will, engage that challenge, making it harder or easier to vote. The argument about fraud, about nefarious activities around voting, I'm suspicious that groups and people who want to make voting harder are going to have to come up with a different argument, because there's just no empirical data to demonstrate that we have widespread voter fraud. And so I don't know that argument, and that it's a scare tactic in many ways, can keep carrying the argument in legislative chambers about when it comes to restricting the right to vote. I think there's going to have to be another argument that emerges, and I don't know what that argument is.
Professor Black, anything you want to add to that?
I think Dr. Kidd's covered it. I guess I would just say, I mentioned this in passing, but I do think the fact that we have a narrative of election fraud coming out of this election, we don't have evidence of it, but we have a narrative of it, does complicate the politics. So it increases the incentives for some elected officials to move forward with anti-fraud kinds of legislation, even if there isn't really potential fraud to combat. But I am hopeful, given that we did have the expansion of these forms of voting. Some of this expansion was temporary, but some of it was permanent. So we have some states that have already expanded the right to vote and the opportunities for access, I should say. And my hope is, as we get more evidence from that, just like when Oregon and Washington start with vote by mail, other states see it work and they decide to try it too. The laboratories of democracy, states give us these opportunities. I do think we may see other states realizing this might actually be a more efficient, cheaper, and better way to vote. So we may begin to see the tide moving in that direction.
We have a question that points to some of the anxiety that was felt during Election Day, when states would not vote or would not count mail-in ballots or absentee ballots until after Election Day. Do either of you see a move towards requiring same-day counting of those ballots, so we're not waiting 2 or 3 days for, a Pennsylvania or a Georgia?
I don't think we're going to see a move to that, because that would have to be a federal action, and federal actions for voting tend to need to be constitutional amendments. So I just don't think we're going to see that kind of movement. Although we definitely saw that the states who began processing those ballots early faced far less pressures. It was a lot easier for the election officials in those states. There was a lot less pressure on those states. So I wouldn't be surprised if, at least internally, state legislatures are going to be thinking, and election officials in particular are going to be saying, listen, this added so much more pressure. This added so much more complexity. This made so many people focus kind of a microscope onto our state. We don't want to be the focus of that attention. If we had just tabulated the ballots early, we wouldn't be in the middle of all these legal battles. So it seemed, it was the case that the states who chose to wait to tabulate the ballots were also the states that faced the most legal reaction and the most sort of voter disdain.
Thank you.
I would just say I would agree. The way the federal government is going to, if there's going to be any uniform movement, it's going to have to be an incentivized movement. So post 2000 election, Florida election fiasco, the federal government, Congress passed some legislation that incentivized states to sort of upgrade their voting system. So you could see some incentivization like that, but I don't think it's going to do what you suggested, which is to sort of uniformly set rules for early counting of ballots. But let me tell you what might incentivize some states themselves to do it, and that is, staff. So in many states, elections officers and their volunteers work a couple of times a year. And it's really hard on them to have to collect all of those early votes, early ballots, and then wait until the day that they're the busiest ever to have to count them. And so it may be that legislatures in various states say, look, it's just too hard on the staff, and we're going to lose volunteers if we just keep pounding them like that on election day. And so it may be that is what incentivizes some states themselves to say, well, you can count those ballots the day before, or the week before, but you have to lock up the results, under serious security so nobody knows what they are. That may be what does it.
Well, I don't think we can talk about voter mobilization and voter turnout, especially in the state of Georgia, without talking about Stacey Abrams. I don't know how much either two of you know about the details of her work there, but can you help us to get a sense of just the magnitude of what happened in Georgia and Stacey Abrams' organization, Fair Fight?
I'll defer. Or I can go either way. I can just say, everybody is paying attention to this year and the results in Georgia, but it's really the result of multiple years of work. Again, going back to that larger narrative, that sort of 240-year narrative that I briefly went through. If the fight now is not one of legal access, but ability to vote, that's where organizations like Stacey Abrams' organization, and there are others around the country, are going to come in this next sort of decade. I think that's going to be the story of the next decade here in the United States when it comes to how people, what kind of turnout we're going to have, and who gets to vote. It's going to be a lot of organizations that do a lot of mobilizing of people around the rules that are existing in those states, and then attempting to change those rules. I think that's really where the next decade of this question is.
And one thing I would just add, it did change the rules. It reminds us that the mobilization piece is so important. It also reminds us that, every vote matters. The presidential election was very narrow in Georgia, and both of the Senate races were very narrow in Georgia. Yeah. So we know the mobilization mattered because the races were so narrow. When we see high-profile narrow races like this tells people, maybe I do have a chance. I'm from Georgia. Democrats never win in Georgia. Why bother to vote? Well, actually, Democrats did win in Georgia this year. So it helps people flip the narrative. If you're in a blue state, maybe it's not as blue as you think. If you're in a red state, maybe it's not as red as you think. And so I do think there's a potential to energize people to vote in a way where they might have just assumed it didn't matter, and otherwise they would just stay home.
Do you know if Stacey Abrams did anything different than has been done, or did she just do it better and harder and, you know, with more determination than has been done before? I liken her to Ralph Reed. I mean, I think in terms of political mobilization, she's the most significant single individual in terms of voter mobilization since Ralph Reed, back in whenever Ralph Reed was around. I think he was in the 80s.
He's still around.
Yeah, he's still around, right? But what was her secret?
I think it was lots of work since her loss in the governor's race, lots of work, and then an enormous amount of funding that came in as it became clear from the polling that Georgia was going to be competitive, coupled with a slight disorganization on the Republican side that meant turnout on the Republican side was not quite what it could have been. And I think that explains the 10,000 plus vote margin. That's how close Georgia is.
And I think that is important to note that there were definitely going to be some Republicans that didn't know what to do because they were getting mixed messages.
Right. This
was a fraudulent election. You can't trust it. Go vote. So which do you pick? So there was clearly a concern about that suppression. One other thing I would just note too, I do think the context of the gubernatorial race is really important because Abrams lost in a pretty narrow loss. And they'd already been doing a lot of this voter registration work in the lead up to her gubernatorial run. They didn't succeed, but they got close. And I think the fact that she was so close to becoming the governor of Georgia and the first African-American governor in the United States, it sort of gave even more incentive both for the activists to work as well as fundraising and that kind of thing. So we're really close. Let's make it work this next election. So that momentum was really important as well.
For both of you, who controls redistricting plans and what's likely to happen and how they use the 2020 census?
Who can,
that question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we haven't probably talked enough about redistricting, given that this is the year of redistricting. Who controls it is the legislature in every state, unless the state has an independent commission that does it, like California, for example. But it's the legislature in most states, which is why redistricting is used as a tool in either the effort to expand or suppress turnout. Because if you draw a district, let's say that you live in a state that is controlled by Republicans, and they draw a district that is heavily Democratic, 70% Democratic. Well, the Democrat's going to win in that district every time. And that may discourage Democrats from turning out to vote because it's not competitive, to Professor Black's earlier comment about competitiveness and how that draws turnout. And so, redistricting is used by both sides. Both parties are guilty of gerrymandering. It's become, so I liken we've always redistricted. Massachusetts gets credit, Governor Gary, but it was actually Virginia where the first, what we call gerrymandering took place. And it was an effort to draw James Madison out of his congressional district early on. So it's been around for 200 plus years, but it has become lethal in the age of powerful little computers that sit on your desk and can crunch thousands and thousands and thousands of bytes of data, because you now can draw a household out of a district sitting on your laptop with no supercomputer power at all. And so while gerrymandering has always been around, it was sort of a rough art until about the last 15 or 20 years, and now it's become a lethal sharp knife, and that's what's made it so deadly to democracy in my view.
I would just add a couple of things. One, sort of talking about the partisan nature of a lot of gerrymandering, and as Dr. Kidd has noted, it's become really scalpel level decisions that are made because of the access to data and computers that we have that make it so much easier now. But it also has this interesting effect of changing the role of primaries, which then, of course, changes the composition of the U.S. Congress. So in many districts, when you have something gerrymandered in such a way that we know the Republican is going to win, or we know the Democrat is going to win because the partisan composition of that district, what it means is that the race for that election happens in the primary, not in the general election. And of course, fewer voters turn out in primaries, and typically party activists and more extreme voters turn out in primaries. So what happens is there is a pressure for candidates to move to the extremes of their party. So Democrats will be more progressive, Republicans will be more conservative in order to win the primary electorate, as opposed to the general election electorate, which would be more moderate. So this also, I think, puts pressure on partisan polarization. The other piece I'd mention too is that's going to complicate things coming up for the 2022 elections is the complexity of the 2020 census. With so many things delayed because of COVID and just because of the extreme, it's always difficult to get a full enumeration of the American people. You add in on top of it the Trump administration's attempt to get a citizenship question onto the census. It didn't make it, but it provided, I'm sure it added to some level of fear and concern about participating in the census. Then it's harder to get people to participate because people aren't really opening their doors to folks, even if they have masks on and say they're from the government. So all the complexities mean that the count was more complicated than usual. It was probably less complete than usual. The Supreme Court has ruled it has to be an official enumeration and cannot be a statistical one. So they're still working on the data. They're behind on the data. So the data coming out of this 2020 census are just not going to be as robust and thorough as we would have expected of a census in the 21st century.
You know, just to pick up on that, Virginia is among the first states to typically get census data because we have elections in off years in Virginia. We have to redistrict really early. So typically we would have already gotten in Virginia our data from the census by the end of January. They've already told Virginia that they're going to be a couple months late. And so it's likely that we have to have legislative elections this fall under the old data, and then again next year with the new census data. So it's already, the late census data is already affecting some states in terms of their ability to hold elections under new maps.
So I'm going to ask our two expert political scientists to make some political prognostications here. Just have fun. So both of you have referenced the 2022 elections. And of course, when we think of elections in America, we think of Democrats and Republicans, and the parties frame these elections. And yet any student of American politics realizes that all is not well in the Democratic household and all is not well in the Republican household right now. In fact, the phrase civil war has been used more than once to describe what's going on in the Republican Party. Can both of you just look into your crystal ball or whatever prophetic devices you use, and just what do you see as the near future for both of the parties going forward? And how will that affect their electoral prospects?
So I think of it predicting in the context of questions. Do Republicans find a space where they can come to terms with the populist nationalist wing of their party and the what I would call the country club Republican wing of the party? And then do Democrats, are Democrats able to allow the progressive voice that is increasingly empowered in the party? Are Democrats able to allow that progressive voice to feel like it is accomplishing some of its progressive goals without alienating the small but significant and important moderate vote in the Democratic coalition? And so I'm not confident about that Republican question anytime soon. There's talk.
Oh my gosh. Dr. Black, you want to finish the sentence for him? There's talk.
I can't finish the sentence, but I can offer some thoughts.
Okay.
So, this is definitely something that it remains to be seen. As Dr. Kidd was saying, the Republican coalition, it's just very unclear what's going to happen. In part, I think a lot depends on obviously what happens with former President Trump. Yeah. We'll see some things coming out of this week and next with the Senate and the impeachment hearings. We'll see what they decide if he were to be convicted and then barred from future office. I think that would definitely provide a signal that the sort of the Trumpist wing of the party will have less momentum. If not, we'll just have to wait and see, I think, in part, what the former president decides to do and to what extent he might want to run in 2024. So there's a lot of internal battle, I would say, going on right now in the Republican Party. So we don't know his legacy yet. It's still to be determined, but it's obviously a work in progress. I don't think we're going to know a lot in the 2022 election for a couple of reasons. I think we really need to be looking to, not that I'm good at telling the future, but to tell a future, it's more of 2024, right. In part because it's a presidential election, but also in part because 2022, if you just look at the maps, particularly in the Senate, Republicans will be defending far more seats than Democrats, and particularly with folks like Rob Portman retiring and things. This is not going to be an easy year for Republicans to pick up seats. Going into it, knowing nothing about the candidates, you can kind of assume that you will probably see some Democratic pickups. So the Senate is not something that's trending Republican. On the other side, though, the House is going to depend so much on what we just talked about, on the districts that are drawing in the census data that's coming in late. And the margin in the House, it's not something we've talked about a lot post-2020 election, but the margin in the House narrowed significantly. This was not something that was necessarily, at least not very many people were suggesting that the House was even in play. So the fact that the margins narrowed in the House does suggest to me that the House could be very much in play for the Republicans to take back over control. But again, it depends on those 435 districts, what they look like, the states that control the redistricting, and the many states where it's a partisan process. So 2020, I think, is going to be quite an interesting election, but I think we'll see more things coalesce as we coalesce towards the 2024 election, when it's much more of a nationalized election between the final decision, who represents the Republican Party and from what wing of the party is that person, and who represents the Democratic Party. We might see Biden run again, but given his age, I think it is very fair to assume that Biden may choose to be a one-term president. Again, we don't know that, but if he doesn't choose to run for re-election, then who becomes the standard bearer for Biden will also give us, I think, a window into how the Democratic Party is moving.
I would just add one. I think a lot. I would agree. The House is where I think in 2022, obviously the House is where the action is. The House is sort of like the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for Democrats, in the sense that if the Biden administration is able to get a hold of the pandemic and actually help the economy recover, et cetera, pretty quickly, and by that I mean 12 months or so, I think it might bode well for Democrats in 2022, because I think the mood of the country is really, really dependent upon overcoming this pandemic, especially economically overcoming it. And however, if the Biden administration is seen as not being very successful or not successful fast enough, 2022 could be a wipeout for Democrats. I mean, Republicans could pick up a dozen or 24 seats in the House simply because voters are frustrated that the Biden administration is not accomplishing enough quickly enough when it comes to the pandemic.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about, we had talked about religion before. What do you see, both of you, what do you see as paramount issues that are going to affect our kind of electoral system going forward?
I can defer.
So could you just explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so we've talked about the electoral system. We've talked about how we structure voting and primaries and all, and we've overlaid that with, pandemic, the movements that are out there. And I guess my question is for both of you, as you look to the near future again, what do you see as 1, 2, 3? Dr. Kidd, you mentioned handling the pandemic as a big issue. What do you two see as other big issues that are going to be, we're going to have to deal with?
Sure. And I'm happy to offer a few thoughts to start. So one, and this kind of comes off of Dr. Kidd's comments, but is the economy. Obviously, the economy has been hurt drastically by the pandemic. So it's not just a question of how we come back, but in what way we come back. And I think we're going to see potentially some permanent shifts in what our economy looks like, and they're going to affect people in different economic sectors differently. So what kind of direction are elected officials offering? And I think of this at the state and the local level, as well as at the federal level. What direction are people offering for a prosperous economy, but not only a prosperous economy, which we always want, but one in which people at different stages of the economy and different participants, so that it's a prosperous economy, not just for the upper middle class worker and the higher income families, but for the working class and for those with a high school education only. Are we seeing real job opportunities? So I think the economy is going to be a big issue. Immigration, kind of keeps coming up. We're seeing a lot of signs that the Biden administration is going to be trying to work in more directions on something like a comprehensive immigration reform. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen to that, because we've had so many presidents attempt this from both parties and have not succeeded. On the other hand, we may have reached a point where there's enough of a sense of something has to be done, that both the left and right acknowledge that we're at a breaking point. So I do think there's an opportunity, particularly for bipartisan work on immigration. And then I think once we kind of get out of the pandemic, we'll be looking again at healthcare and thinking about access to healthcare, thinking about the health insurance system, thinking about ways in which the Affordable Care Act has worked, ways in which it hasn't worked. So I think we'll begin to have that conversation at a different level. Right now, it's so much more about just what is the healthcare system doing to deal with COVID and its effects. I think we'll begin to have more of the bigger picture. In what ways is our system working? In what ways is it not? And when we have a little time from the pandemic, what did we learn from the pandemic about the strengths and weaknesses and holes in our healthcare system? So those are three issues. I think these are, always going to be big issues, but those are three issues I expect will be at the forefront.
So just to pick up on that, let me the economy, but let me just give you a sense of how challenging this is. So I think, one of the things that's sort of driven the economic anxiety argument over the last decade has been globalization, free trade and all that. So the first sort of big comprehensive free trade agreement was passed in the early 1980s. So since the 1980s to the 2016 election of Donald Trump, if you just take the economic parts of the economic populist, the economic nationalist parts of his argument, the challenge has been exactly what Dr. Black said. How do you transition an economy without leaving behind big chunks of it? And I would argue that we largely have failed to do that successfully when it comes to globalization and free trade. Add on top of that, so we haven't successfully done it, and those issues are still there. Add on top of that, transitioning an economy in the context of climate change. That's the challenge the Biden administration and, quite frankly, all of us have, because climate change is going to require us to transition our economy. And we don't quite have we're not successfully transitioning an economy through free trade and global trade. And now we've got to add on top of that climate change and how we transition into a cleaner economy. Now, maybe that's the answer to the other problem. That's, I think, what optimists would say. But that, I think, is sort of our existential challenge going forward, over the next decade, I think, really. I agree, immigration and healthcare are massive challenges. But I think our real existential challenge is we can't keep leaving behind chunks of our economy, chunks of our population relative to our economy, or we're going to continue to have great political turmoil like we had in 2016. Because when people are suffering economically, it brings out the worst in people, the racism and all of that sort of stuff. And we just can't, I don't think we can continue to live through those kind of populist upheavals and survive, quite frankly.
Well, thank you. Sobering thoughts from both of you, but we're in a sober time.
We are.
As we begin to, speaking of transitioning, as we begin to transition to the conclusion of this session, I want to pick up on a question that was submitted and broaden it just a little bit. The question was, hearing the account about gerrymandering just kind of frustrates us as individual citizens. And the question is, what can we do as individual citizens to address the issue of gerrymandering? And I want you to answer that, and then I want you to, if both of you would be willing to broaden that and just say, what is it that you want us to take away from tonight? So what can the individual citizen do about gerrymandering? And then comma, and here's what I want you to walk away from tonight with. Dr. Kidd, you want to start us off with that?
Sure. Look, the foundational thoughts about our politics, if you go back to the beginning, even if we didn't put them into practice initially, was that individual people mattered in our polity, and I think that's as important or more important today than it ever has been. I would say that as it relates to gerrymandering, district lines are drawn mostly by partisans in legislatures based upon the data that they have available, and that data is largely about people who vote. Large parts of our population of people who are eligible to vote don't vote, and so I've seen it in Virginia. I have seen districts that were gerrymandered flip, and and if you go back and look at why, it's because chunks of the population that weren't voting suddenly started voting. They were mobilized in some way for some reason. And so I would argue that number one, vote and encourage everyone to vote. But number two, if you think that the process of the way redistricting is done in your particular state is, inherently sort of flawed, then there are lots of movements out there, lots of organizations that are attempting to reform the way redistricting is done. And again, I'm using Virginia as an example because this is where I am. We just created an independent bipartisan redistricting commission. We sort of took redistricting a little bit out of the hands of the legislature, if not totally. And we're a southern state, so it's not impossible for reforms like that to happen in a southern state. They don't all just happen in Arizona and California and places like that. And so that's partly what I would argue. And then I would argue what is the bigger sort of lesson or the bigger sort of takeaway, and that is I try to sort of always look more positively on things. We've gone through a really, really tough 4 years. We went through a really, really tough presidential election. And you know what? To reference something that Dr. Black raised earlier, we had massive turnout, and even if a certain portion of the population of voters is unhappy with the results, we had massive turnout, and we had, with rare exception, clean and fair elections in all these states. And so at the end of the day, It worked. It worked like it's supposed to work. And there's nothing that says politics isn't going to be dirty and messy. There's nothing that says people we elect aren't going to really irritate us sometimes. And at the end of the day, if you vote and if the elections are free and fair, what more can you ask for? I mean, you can ask for more of that and better of that, but ultimately, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kidd. Dr. Black.
So I just, on that first part of your question, if I understand it, the person posing the question was coming from a position that partisan gerrymandering is a problem. And so if you come from that position, like Dr. Kidd said, there are lots of reform movements that we have been seeing growing up around the country. And in recent years, a number of big moves have been made. So if you think a movement toward a nonpartisan system is a good one, there are lots of states to look at as models, and there are ways to encourage and to get sort of to activate on those issues and to get involved and to make a difference. You know, in some ways it's hard because the people who often have to make these changes are the very people whose districts would be affected by it. So some states have used the referendum process. There are different methods for trying to change the way we draw districts. But look at what's happened in other states. Look where it has seemed to have been successful, and look for what lessons you can learn, and then bring those back to your state to see if you can make changes. Because I do think we're at the beginning of a big wave of reform there. As far as my takeaway, very much like Dr. Kidd, as he noted, we have a long history. It's taken a long time to expand voting rights in the United States. And even as they were expanded, we've seen efforts to then try to retract some of those practically. And so we've had that ebb and flow, but I do think 2020 reminds us sort of it's the flow, not the ebb of the tide. There's much to celebrate. To have the record numbers of people voting and to see turnout increase in every state, to me, this is exciting. And this, I think, should be exciting if you're a Republican, if you're an independent, if you're a Democrat, to know that we've had more people exercising their right to vote, more people participating in our democracy. So if we can do it in a pandemic under the worst of circumstances, it gives me great hope that we can continue to expand opportunity and encourage people that their vote matters and that their vote is important, and then get those folks out to vote.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much again, Dr. Amy Black from Wheaton College, Dr. Quentin Kidd from Christopher Newport University. What wonderful contributions you made, especially those last comments. I want to put them in a bottle and send them to all my students. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we wish you all the best. So,
thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, I also want to give some special thanks to some other people as we conclude. A special thanks to Alice Taylor Colbert, who's the project director for the South Carolina Humanities, who's been leading this effort for this initiative. I want to express my appreciation also to Courtney Myers, the Lander staff member, who's helped keep us afloat. And what a great job she did trying to keep Quentin Kidd with us and viable. Thank you so much. Three last things by way of reminder. Please, please, please be sure to complete the survey that is linked to your chat. This survey, SurveyMonkey, helps us tremendously with future initiatives. Secondly, please take a look at the suggested readings offered for tonight's program. I think tonight offered all of us some great and provocative questions that we want to pursue. So there are some suggested readings and resources on the Lander webpage linked to this program. Please take advantage of that. Third and finally, please join us for more Electoral Initiative events. The next event occurs on Monday, February the 15th at 7 p.m. And this program comes from Francis Marion University, one of the 4 schools that are involved in this initiative. And the program's entitled Ranked Choice Voting, a Better Alternative? ? Ranked choice voting has been growing in popularity and it's been incorporated into local and state elections all across the country. The February 15th session features 3 Francis Marion political science faculty who will discuss the positive and negative impacts of increasing voter input via this method. So we hope to see you on February the 15th. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your patience through our technical difficulties. But what a rich and, I think, a very encouraging session this was. And with that, we wish you a good evening.